joining us today. Before we get started, I always like to do a shout out for DoSpace. I don't get paid to say wonderful things about DoSpace, but I do think they're wonderful. And just in case you don't know, they are a community technology library dedicated to empowering our community through access to technology and innovative learning experiences. And just before we came online, I said, something like DoSpace, which really is, if not unique, unusual in the United States, is it's so well designed to help during the time of the pandemic, and I hope that you support them as well. For those of you who don't know me, I've been working for libraries and allied institutions as a trainer and consultant since 1978. And because of my work, I have been a frequent visitor to Omaha, to your state library commission, to universities and libraries and businesses and across Omaha and Council Bluffs and stuff for many, many years. Now, one of the reasons I came to run this program, that from 1975 to 2000, my husband and I ran an information service that specialized in working with innovators. We would do work for the major newspapers, not just locally, but nationally. I've worked with people who've written for the Wall Street Journal, worked with a senior editor at the New York Times, worked with people who were private investigators who specialized in business fraud, and lawyers as well. And our clients ranged from large companies looking for key information to people investigating criminal activity, small businesses, individuals who wanted all sorts of stuff, and even kids looking for homework. And we work closely with libraries and universities in the area as well. And we became one of those places that if people had a question about something, like, is this new way of making wealth legitimate, or is it just a Ponzi scheme? Or there's somebody in town who says they're going to be writing big checks for new ideas. Are they legitimate, or are they scam artists? So we got involved with them. And something like 40% of our clients were writers and journalists. So we got very much involved with people who were publishing books and writing books and everything. And I tell people that it's kind of like that old a metaphor about once you've been to the sausage factory and see how the sausages are actually made, it's really hard to eat a hot dog again. Well, after working behind the scenes for years, before the internet and before the current political climate, I got to see a lot of fake news firsthand. And so you have to understand that I don't trust anybody, meaning that the most wonderful news site in the world could publish something that I absolutely believe is true, and I would still triple check it and check it for my own confirmation bias, what I believe, plus with 100 other people, before I'd ever think to repost it at all. And by the way, the images we're using today are from a free public domain site called pixabay.com. They're great people. We do support them, and we hope that you do too. Every time I do a program, I have a key idea. And the key idea today is that if you're really interested in improving your ability to do research for yourself, for your family, for your friends, for the businesses or nonprofits you work for, you want to stay curious. You never want to be satisfied with what you see. And you need to do two things. You need to both verify and refute, because everything can change very quickly, as we know. I mean, breaking news is kind of an oxymoron. It's breaking news, but it really isn't news. It's just a snapshot of whatever gets pushed in front of our noses today, and it could change in 2 hours. And so that's what's important. Now, what do I mean by verify, and what do I mean by refute? Verification is when you're trying to prove that the information might be correct. And you'll notice that I use a lot of adverbs, because most of the time we will never have a perfect picture of what's going on. For example, there's been a lot in the news about demonstrations that we've been experiencing as a nation the last few weeks. One of my mentors, Kathy Bradshaw, who was an award-winning news reporter and news editor here in Colorado for radio stations and TV stations here and in other states, and is now a professor of journalism in Ohio, used to say that when she would go down to report on a demonstration of some kind, the people running the demonstration would predictably report twice as many people who were actually there, and the cops would report half as many people as were actually there. So reporters used to create their own little simple algorithm to basically figure out how many people are there, because it's not like everyone comes into the plaza and stands still and is counted. People are coming in, they're coming out. You could count the same person 5 times, and every part of a large area is its own little world. So you may be in one part of, say, the Denver Civic Plaza downtown experiencing one thing, and literally 20 feet away, someone's going to be experiencing something else. So verification isn't as easy as you think. And we have to watch out for the fact that truth is not a democracy, meaning that just because a lot of people agree about something doesn't automatically make it true. So verifying things is really important, and figuring out how you have to kind of go back in time and say, is this photo legitimate? If so, how do I know that's true? Is this article legitimate? If so, how do I know this is true? So that's what verification is, proving the information might be correct. Now, what's actually a better way to deal with the truth is what we call refutation. And refutation comes from the work of an author named Karl Popper, who was a philosopher from Austria, who lived in England for many years, and he came up with this idea of conjecture and refutation. I think it's the title of one of his books. And what he wanted people to do was the fact that if you have the greatest thing in the world in front of you, the best thing you can do for it is metaphorically tear it to bits. Who disagrees? Who has different information? Who has contradictions? And so one of the things of reading and following the work of Karl Popper taught myself and my husband that if somebody came to us with a great idea, it wasn't enough just to look for instances that agreed with the idea or the news, but also to look for people who disagreed with it and the news. And doing it that way became a very quick way to determine that at least at any given time, and this is anecdotal, my personal opinion, take it with a big grain of salt, at any given time, at least 50% of the stuff that we see online is simply not true. And if you could take 5 minutes, you would be able to see, oh my goodness, this is not anything to do with the truth. And by the way, everybody does it. I don't care what your political position is or what part of the political or philosophical spectrum you are or the speaker is. So nobody gets a free pass, including people I like and people whose positions I agree with. So we hope that several things come out of today. First of all, that whenever whoever they are in your life, politicians, commentators, people who are writing articles about stuff, say things like, we must trust and respect these people, that you put a pause button on and say, what do you actually mean by the word trust, and what do you actually mean by the word respect? Because our species is very easily manipulated by what some people call banner words. Like there's this big banner over the door of the institution saying, we will trust and respect people, without really digging down and saying, what did they mean by those words? The second thing is to build yourself your own think tank of people you like and trust from a variety of positions. And I'm not talking about online pundits. I'm talking about people at local universities, people who are independent scholars, people who dig into things in different ways, who have a different point of view from you, who vote politically differently, who are from a different age, a different background, so that something comes up that's important to you that you intend to share with other people and actually make decisions on, take action on. You want your think tank to review this, and I'm not talking about anything formal. It just might be running something by someone. And I think, without exception, that at least once or twice a day, both my husband and myself, every single day, run something by someone else who may be different from us to say, what do you see that I don't see? Or what do you know that I don't know? Use this idea of verification and refutation, being able to look at, can I prove this is true with physical evidence, right? I've seen the original document, or can I prove it may not be true? Again, because I was able to dig up the complete original document and the original photo. Um, Being able to help people, particularly if you're someone who works with younger people, to avoid clickbait, you know, those outrageous headlines and most breaking news bulletins. I'm going to share with you a list of what I call legitimate breaking news. Um, not the kind that just gets us all excited about things, but I started preparing for this class by looking at headlines from a variety of sources, and I scan the headlines from about 30 or 40 publications a day because it's my job. And there are people who are professionals who probably do 100 or 200 a day. And I find most of the time the headline exaggerates facts and escalates whatever conflict is going on, so that they'll say there's just recently, you know, I read a headline that said mass shooting in a mall, mass shooting. Well, does the word mass to you say 50 people? Does the word mass to you suggest one person was shot critically and the other person was shot, and there were two people and the three people seem to know each other and not get along? No, mass shooting sort of implies, again, the horrible thing of a stranger coming in and mowing down 30 or 40 people. That wasn't what the story was. But if you glanced at the headline, it's more evidence that, oh my goodness, another mass shooting. So we want you to become calm. Want you to sort of take some of the drama out of your life by saying, I'm going to wait until I have the time to read the whole story. Otherwise, I'm just kind of breeze over this. And then even with, especially with places you trust and people you trust in, like including maybe Pat Wagner after today, you want to ask tough questions. You want to ask over and over again, is this a fact? Is it an opinion? Is it an interpretation? Why should I trust and believe what you've just told me? And what's in it for you? That's always a question we ask people. So what we're going to talk a little bit about is more about why fake news isn't new. It's something that's been going on for decades, centuries, and why personally I'm skeptical, with a few anecdotes from my history. Why human beings are unreliable. We're not a reliable species. I keep telling my husband, this is Earth, not Vulcan. He's from Vulcan. My husband and I have been together for a number of years, and I don't think I've ever heard my husband even tell a white lie, let alone a lie about anything. He's just so careful. And it took him a long time to realize that, oh my goodness, there's some people who don't tell the truth. Some of the pitfalls of using online resources and mastering them. And what I've accumulated is a list of resources for you of people. Who are the people who, you know, are guarding the chickens, right? There's foxes guarding the chickens, so who's guarding the foxes who are allegedly guarding the chickens? So some resources that I think are kind of interesting about how professional journalists and investigators and people in the legal profession look at all this sort of information. So this is something, and it's kind of bothersome to me, and for the record, I am in the minority, okay? So take what I say, again, with a grain of salt. I don't like these lists and tables that are very popular right now, basically saying, here are the trustworthy news outlets, and these are the ones you can trust. Not because I think the people who are posting this list are doing anything bad, but the problem is it sort of turns off our judgment, and we say, oh, since this particular list says that Reuters or The Guardian or The Atlantic Monthly or Christian Science Monitor, all fine publications, are trustworthy, I will no longer question anything that they print, and I will believe what they believe. And I think this is something very dangerous. I don't want, no matter what your belief system, no matter if you and I disagree very strongly about something, I don't want you to let anyone else decide what you should believe, right? What you think is true or what you think is not true. I want you to do your research on your own and come up with your opinion on your own. So the shortcut that I think a lot of well-meaning people are posting with these infographics really bother me a lot, because it's like handing over our decision-making to someone else, and I don't approve. So first of all, why does Pat sound so skeptical? What happened to you, Pat? Were you in an accident or something? Well, there are, first of all, a number of historical cases going back many, many decades of how people were fooled. And for fun, I pulled out three published by three pretty credible places. One is the infamous George Creel book, How We Advertised America, which is available for free online, and you can also find published copies out there in the public domain very cheap. And George Creel was an advertising person who was actually hired by the United States government during World War I to create the propaganda that got us into World War I. And he very blatantly described the whole process that he went through and how he manipulated an entire nation into thinking World War I was a good thing. Well, if you've done your history, you know that World War I is one of the most, if any war is justified, this was one of the stupidest, most unjustified, horrifying wars in the history of the planet that killed millions and millions of people, all sort of starting with somebody shooting someone and then somebody else getting upset and, well, we have a treaty with you and we'll pile on, and the United States getting sucked in by a peace president, Woodrow Wilson, into the war. So again, reading something written almost 100 years ago is very sobering about the idea of the news. Smithsonian Magazine talked about this a couple of years ago, this issue of fake news, and had some wonderful examples of the way the media at the time, going back into the mid 1800s, wrote stories that were blatantly not true to push different political positions. And the same thing with the Columbia Journalism Review. So these are three places, particularly the Smithsonian Magazine and the Columbia Journalism Review, which are both entertaining and horrifying, to give you a perspective that what we're talking about isn't something new at all. Also, there are people who think about this a lot. And what I did was dig into some really interesting sources of scholars and scientists who think a lot about the scientific version of fake news. And I think that this information, and I put this together a while ago, but now with all of the conflicting information having to do with the virus, I think that everyone should educate themselves about how scientists who've been doing this work for many, many decades look at their peers and say, what's working and what's not working. And I kind of went through all of these, and here's what's nice. They're all written in layperson's language, so you don't have to have a PhD to understand it. One from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, talking about how to review a paper. What kinds of things does a scientist look at if they're looking at a study to see if it's valid? The Center for Scientific Integrity, boy, is one of my favorite websites about this information, because they have something called Retraction Watch. And what they do is create a database of every time a scientific paper is pulled or thrown out from a credible science or medical magazine, and like the New England Journal of Medicine or the Lancet in England, and people are publishing all sorts of stuff. And it's kind of like with a newspaper where the story's on the front page, but the retraction might be on page 32. Here's a place to kind of go through and see, remember that study that got everyone in a tizzy that said A, B, and C 10 years ago? Well, guess what? The scientist was discredited. All their work was pulled. They had to pay fines, and they might even go to jail. But that's not the part you hear about, right? So Retraction Watch is a way to start educating yourself as a layperson why it's so hard these days to figure out who's telling the truth or not, even from what we might think are credible sources. And then a whole interesting information about what we call the peer review, which is supposed to be the gold standard for what's published, what's communicated, that a group of people kind of go over everything and decide if it's right or wrong or not. And this article is very I'd say interesting in talking about the fact that peer review can be as political as anything else. And if somebody comes up with an idea that challenges the status quo in science, and particularly in medicine, there's going to be a lot of pushback. And we have lots of examples to go through with people who came up with wonderful ideas and were practically jailed. And then we find out 20 years later, they were absolutely right. So here's some places to sort of educate yourself a little bit about how scholarly people think about the ideas we're talking about. Now, here's my little stories to share with you. And I'll go through them quickly, but I tried to come up with 8 examples out of many that would illustrate some of the things I'm talking about. The phony quote. This was a book that was published a few years ago, bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. We were featured in it because of some work we had done with the author. Didn't know it was going to happen. And I was writing something based on something she wrote. And there was a quote from somebody who was famous at the time and who had passed on. And I couldn't find anything about the quote. And I looked through the papers. I happened to have a number of the person's books at our house and went through, couldn't find anything. So finally I called this very famous award-winning author and I said, on page 43 of your book, you say that so-and-so says this. And there was silence. And I will make up her name. She's not with us these days, but still. And I said, Abby, where did you get this quote? And I said, or did you meet with him? Was this something from an interview? And she said, well, I just figured he might have said it, and it just furthered the information I had. I wanted to prove a point, so I just invented the quote. And I was like, you published this with a major newspaper. Didn't anyone ever fact check? They said, no, because they knew I knew him. And they didn't even call. If they had called and asked, I would have told them the truth, but nobody ever asked, and I didn't tell. So doesn't it make you wonder what else in the book that you might question and how many other people do that? Faked news. And this, I will mention a name. A long time ago, USA Today was gearing up and they were ready to go to press. And because I worked with so many newspaper reporters and publishers, they contacted me and they wanted me to be a stringer for USA Today in Denver. I was so proud. It meant about $1 an hour. It's not a lot of money to be a stringer, but what you're doing is writing news and reports from the field, usually without a byline, but still, oh my goodness, it was great. So they called me up and they said, understand you have a lot of prostitutes in Denver. And I said, well, not really. Our office is right here off the main street, Colfax, not many. Well, do you know any prostitutes? And I said, well, I see the ladies and I wave and they wave back, don't know their names. Well, we want you to go up and ask them a bunch of provocative quotes that we can have in our first edition. And I said, I am not. That's going to be rude. I'm not going to do that. So they went, okay, fired me on the spot and said, we'll just make them up. And sure enough, in the first edition, there were quotes coming from Denver that were made up. How many quotes are made up, do you wonder, right? A big book came out, big, important book. And again, I'm old school, so I'll talk about books, not just magazines and newspapers and online. And it was an important book. And there was a report about an important Midwest project in glowing terms, was in the book. And they even gave the address. Well, that's great, except months before the book came out, the project failed, went bankrupt. And if you went to that place where that wonderful project, community project, was supposed to be, there would be an empty lot. That was it. Why? Because nobody attached to the project, to the book, ever thought to call up the people who were doing the project, right? The book people never called the people doing the project and says, we're coming up with a book. How's your project going before we put something in print that's going to be on someone's shelf forever? The eavesdropper was funny because it was someone who overheard an article, an argument that my husband and I were having at Christmas at their house. And that person happened to be a book writer, an author, and she put the argument that we were having about something in her book as if it was true. We were, arguing about something having to do with business, and she put it in as a fact. And the fact she put in is that we had been successful raising hundreds and thousands of dollars for a people in small business. Well, I think we got 50 phone calls the day the book came out. And the first week we got 150 phone calls, and each one I had to apologize and say no. And then I tried to reach her, and we're like, where the heck did you come up with this? And she said, remember that argument that you and Leif were having at my house at Christmas? I said, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning and I had had too much eggnog. I don't even remember it. That became part of the book. And again, that major publisher never fact checked it. No one ever called us. One of our clients is a man who's a photojournalist. He personally has written 35 books on nature and science and is one of those people who really does his research. So he goes out and he does photojournalism and sells them to newspapers and magazines all over the country. And when some of the political demonstrations were happening, the first big ones years ago, he would go and he would be there taking pictures of everybody, you know, doing all sorts of things. And he said more than once, someone from a major newspaper or magazine would come up to him and say, hi, you know, no competition, very friendly. And they say, where's the bad stuff? And our friend would say, what do you mean? You know, like the racist stuff and the terrible stuff and the bad people. And he said, well, actually, everyone's just demonstrating very peacefully. This was about 15 years ago. There's no real bad stuff going on. And they say, well, our editors have sent us out to find bad, provocative images. So all this nice, friendly stuff that you're doing with people being peaceable and friendly with each other, that ain't going to cut it. We have to find the bad stuff. And sure enough, our friend would point out to us things that would start appearing online from that particular demonstration that would lead anyone to feel that there were only bad guys there on both sides, right? So that's something that could do cynical. Twisted science is when a friend of ours who was a nurse who did medical reporting and writing got a contract to write an article about brain chemistry. I won't go into it in detail, but she actually called the authors in England who said they didn't like to talk to reporters because reporters would just make up stuff from the stories, and all of their research was being reported wrong in the public press, in the popular press. So she, I'll say her name is Karen. Karen convinced them, not the Karens we're talking about today. Karen will convince them that she was a nurse and a medical reporter and she would do it accurately, and anything she published they would get to vet first. So great article, submitted it to her editor, and her editor said, but this is not the cool, crazy, wacko stuff that everybody else is writing. And Karen said, but that's all lies. And they said, well, we need the wacko stuff. And Karen refused. They didn't publish her article. She got what they call a kill fee for it, and somebody else wrote an article the way the editor did because they found someone who would tell the lies rather than the truth. And fortunately for Karen, she explained the situation, and the scientists were very grateful that she tried to tell the truth about this. Alexandria effect is something I learned in the mid-70s by a wonderful woman named Jo Chenode, who was a librarian's librarian here in Colorado. And she recently passed in her 90s, and I wanted this sort of as a tribute to her, where she was involved with supervising graduate students who were among the first people to type databases online and create some of those big databases that people used for years that were among the first databases people would search for facts. And she said one day they decided to check the error rate on how things were going. And she found to her horror and everyone else's horror that the error rate of how things were being manually typed into these databases was 5 to 12%. And the documents that they were being typed from were then being destroyed. And she said, it's just like the Alexandria libraries. There were multiple libraries destroyed with the name Alexandria. We'll never know what's in them. We'll never know what documents from the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s that went into these databases were destroyed. We will never know what the original information said. And then finally, the myth of the expert writer. where people talk about, oh, Wikipedia is terrible. We need things like the Encyclopedia Britannica that are written by Nobel Prize winners and experts. Well, my older sister, when she was on a work study program in the 1960s, guess what she was doing? She was sitting there at the University of Chicago in a room typing in entries for the Encyclopedia Britannica. And I'm thinking to people, do you really think those Nobel Prize winners that we tout in things like the Encyclopedia Britannica and these world things are always the people writing those articles? We have a friend who makes his living writing articles for the Encyclopedia Britannica, and he's no PhD scientist. So these kinds of things make you less likely to believe everything you read, even in hard copy and especially online. So what do we do about those unreasonable, unreliable human beings? Here's some things to look at. This is an amazing article from the National Center for State Courts, and it's pretty easy to find it. You don't have to type in the whole URL. And it's about how they've pretty much proved that eyewitness accounts are almost totally unreliable to the point that they're hardly being admitted into some courtrooms anymore. So if you look at that idea, and this is back in 2017, the trouble with eyewitness identification, testimony, and criminal cases, wow, it's like something out of Law and Order, one of my favorite shows. So this is a good place to learn about what kind of studies are being done by people whose living it is to see, can we count on what people say they have seen? And doesn't that influence what we talk about online? How we fool ourselves are two sites about critical thinking. The first site, rhetorical fallacies, and I'm stumbling because the people who wrote this made that word up. So don't look it up in a dictionary. But if you go to the site, Information is Beautiful, they have some wonderful resources to help you understand things like confirmation bias, that we immediately are going to be thrilled to read something that already agrees with something we've made our mind up. And then common fallacies at the nobelief.com site also has a wonderful list of things that we have to watch out for in terms of arguments, pro and con about an idea or something. So again, both of them are fun sites. And if you work with younger people, they go nuts over these sites. It's really fun to go through and say, whoa, what is it that other people are doing? And more importantly, of course, what is it that we're doing wrong as well? So what are what we call the research sins? Someone looked at this program before I put it up, and they said, we notice you're using the cherries, and they laughed. The cherries are symbolic of cherry picking the data, meaning that if you're given a survey or a database or an interview with someone, cherry picking means you pull out the information that you want to prove the point that you have and ignore, overlook, or discard and dismiss or even hide information that might not agree with you. And so people hearing you talk about this or hearing someone talk about this says, oh my goodness, that's pretty impressive, because you never get to hear the other sides of the story. So what we have to watch out for is that we tend to look for sites that prove that we are right and they are wrong. Also, there's something called the true believer syndrome. A true believer, and we're not going to talk about faith-based belief that has to do with your religious or spiritual beliefs, okay? Let's put that to a side for another time. When somebody who is what you might call cause-driven, doesn't matter what the cause is, tells me something they believe, I will ask them a couple of questions. I will ask them, how do they know that's true? That's one question. A second question is, what facts would convince you that you were wrong? Is there a fact that I could come up, and if the fact was credible, and we can talk about that at length, but if I was able to come up with facts that you believed were credible, would that be enough to change your mind? A reasonable person says, yeah, I'm open to new facts and things. Let's look and see what you have. A true believer will say, nothing that you demonstrate to me will ever convince my mind. Well, that's kind of a difficult person to have a conversation with if they are not willing to look at a fact to change their mind about something. And again, I've seen this across the board. I don't argue with true believers because it doesn't matter what you say or what information you bring to the table. Real information, not just opinions and interpretations, they are done. And sometimes I think they're just tired because the world can be ambiguous and confusing. Sometimes, as I said before, we rely on reputation. Oh my goodness, it's in this book or by this author on this website from this commentator, and I trust and like them. So I have turned off my thinking part of my brain and just accept what they say. And this is something that's very interesting. We think science means that there is an answer, one answer, and that's the answer, rather than understanding that scientific inquiry is a process. And that's why I say we always have to keep curious. This is what we know today. We might know something very different tomorrow. And then, and this is just a practical consideration, the whole thing of rush to judgment. Breaking news, we get to be the first that learns. Now, my dad was a public health official for many years in the Midwest, and I saw kind of behind the scenes what happened with his work and how many times he was pushed politically by fairly important people to rush to judgment, to make statements to the newspaper that he absolutely knew were not true, and he refused to do it. Because of that, the newspapers trusted him. The media trusted my father not to simply succumb. And more than once, they said, "You will come out with a statement tomorrow." And he said, "Fine, I'll have my resignation on your desk tonight." And then they'd back off because he was so well trusted, they couldn't afford to have him quit on things like that. And I realized not everyone is in that position. So scientists are humans, okay? That's something we have to understand. The con game to manipulate people takes the usual emotions a human has, and depending on which author and literature you believe, that we make 85 to 97% of our decisions emotionally, not based on facts. And so there's a lot of people out there who are either looking for clicks on their website or kudos or likes, or are trying to sell advertising, or trying to build a reputation, or trying to build a political base, whatever it is. And they have learned to play on our emotions and opinions and all the things here. That idea of being an insider, we're going to give you special news that we don't give anyone else. You know, lawyers are very concerned about the idea of yes, it's an allegation. It hasn't been proven scientifically, and we haven't taken it to court and gotten a verdict. All the things that go on, the crisis mongering, maybe it's not a crisis, all the things that go on. So here's a nice list of all the ways we allow ourselves to be manipulated by other people who are presenting ideas and information. And let's assume that there are mostly no bad guys, that they sincerely are thinking they're doing the best because they think their ideas are so important, or they're doing it for business reasons, no harm intended about things. So I don't see the same level of evil people that other folks do. I'm just very, very cautious. As I said before, truth is not a democracy. And one of the places we see this a lot is in polls. Polls are circular. A poll is something that we use to grab someone's opinion, and then publishing the poll influences people's opinion as well. And even if the polls are 100% honest and well done, there's this sort of chicken and egg thing that's going on. And I had someone attend a class I taught on this topic a few weeks ago, and they said, "Well, what do you think of polls?" And I said, "I don't. I put them on the level of entertainment, like celebrity biographies." um, and I certainly don't make any decisions politically about who I'm going to vote for or a bill I'm going to support based on a poll. That's no. I have to look at facts that aren't just about a compilation of other people's opinions. So what are some of the pitfalls of using online resources that are specific? I've mentioned books and magazines a lot. Now, if we're moving away from paper, what does this mean? Okay. Um, One pitfall is that there is so much information pushed at you that it's really easy to believe that suddenly you're an expert on a subject, or the person writing it thinks they're an expert because there's just so much information. You or I could sit down and come up with a aggregated list of 50 websites that we think are great, or put together an article that we plagiarized from 20 different sources that was 5,000 words long. And guess what? Suddenly we're experts. And suddenly you think we're experts because we have all this information. So I call it phony competence. My mother, oh my goodness, working with elderly people. My mother would see something online or a brochure, and my husband and I would say, Esther, that probably's not right. And she would come back with, but the website looks so professional. The brochure is so pretty. Look at those beautiful 4-color pictures. And we're like, Ma, anyone can put up a fancy looking website. I still have people tell me this, where they ask me to vet something, and the first thing they say, oh, isn't it a wonderful website? And I said, yes, and that doesn't tell me if the information they're posting is true or not. Thank you very much. And remember, it can be changed very easily. Names, date, places are changed, and they say something, you go back a week and it's something else. So that's something that we have to be aware of with online work. What I said before, breaking news is an oxymoron, is that if it's breaking, maybe it isn't news, because we're not going to find out the full facts for a day or two. We all need a pause button to stop from reacting to things that come out. And this is something I've noticed is happening more and more. Old ideas are coming out as if they're new and independent. I find a lot of websites are really bad at telling you when something was published. It sometimes takes me a little searching to find an article that looks good and find out it was published in 2004, not 2020, and that maybe the original, when I can find the original, doesn't look like exactly what was published in 2020 because things were changed. And so people circulate old ideas, but also they sometimes present ideas that are old and sometimes pretty well discredited, as if they're fresh and true. So there's that whole thing of cut and paste that goes on a lot, particularly I notice in some of the cause-driven websites where people are going back and cutting things out of context. And, you know, that thing that's been happening for a while, well, they'll find someone who looks like somebody in a provocative or nasty photo and say, look, there's Pat Wagner. And it's great, except that photo was taken in 1935, a few years before I was born. Or it would show me in something in going on in Paris. And no offense, folks, I've never been to Paris. Um, Believing that research shortcuts exist. And for those of us who do it professionally, there's some things that we'll do quickly, but the truth is that if we're doing it right, it takes some time. And yes, you can't rely on Google's search algorithms to give you a good idea of what's out there. You have to kind of cultivate sources that aren't necessarily going to appear in the first 2 pages, and kind of look for the outliers who you might not agree with, who maybe are discarded because they're too provocative for one way or another. I don't discard people just because they annoy me. I disagree with them. Sometimes there's a grain of truth, or they'll ask an interesting question that I need to consider when I'm doing my research. So what do we do? Well, one is that the Illinois Institute of Technology has something I think interesting. Center for the Study of Ethics in the Professions is a good way of seeing how professional groups like lawyers and engineers and scientists and doctors have to think of this idea of how do we tell the truth. So this is a site I really enjoy going through, and it's very humbling as well. TechSpot has a nice list they put out of alternatives, search engines that are alternatives to Google, so that if you're looking for information online, you use different ways of going about it. So TechSpot, which is a good site, has a lot of good technical tools for people. This is interesting. This is the journalist resource, and this is about how journalists, professional journalists, and there's still ones out there, take a look at fake news, at conspiracy theories, all these things, what people are talking about, what the sources are. And again, it's one source that has an opinion, but I find it helps people slow down. And I love that it's public. You don't have to be a journalist to use it, but it's very likely that other journalists who you count on are using sources like this to say, okay, what do other people think? What do other people think who make their living doing research? Now, what's real breaking news? Okay, it's real breaking news to me if I'm living in Omaha and I hear there's a tornado touchdown in Ralston, or there's a traffic jam on I-29 northbound at the I-80 interchange. And yes, I've been there, done that. That, oh my goodness, all the Omaha public schools are going to be closed tomorrow. Or my sweet, sweet, sweet pit bull just got out. Or there's an amber alert or a silver alert. That's something that I would want to be on top of. Somehow they've decided that sunscreen laws that they have in places like California and Florida suddenly apply to Omaha. So don't go on the beach with that sunscreen in Omaha. That there is a plague of locusts approaching Seward, and that makes me very unhappy because I like Seward. I love the library there. Oh, it's a snow day for Waterloo. Wow, and it's July. Or the made-up Fred's Mighty Fine Cafe has been closed for food poisoning. That's, to me, real breaking news. A lot of this other stuff is like, well, it might be breaking news, but how does it influence me personally? And what am I supposed to do with it? Am I supposed to write a letter to my congressperson? Am I supposed to vote on something? Do I need to do more research, which is usually the answer? So when people say, well, Pat, what do you believe is real breaking news? Okay, this is what I call breaking news. When there were major record-breaking fires in the southern part of Colorado, and on a map it looked like the family ranch was the epicenter, I followed at 15 and 20-minute intervals 6 or 7 different news sources, and I found the most valuable one was the emergency center run by local officials that had video casts every 15 minutes telling residents what was there. And guess what? Their information, surprise, was a lot more accurate than the TV station that was 60 miles to the north. So if you're interested in community alerts and you live in or near Douglas County, here's something that you might want to look at is the preparedness and outreach community notification system for the Omaha Douglas County. Those are the kind of sites when we're talking about breaking news that matters to me that I follow, because you have all kinds of early responders and police who really care about the truth, who will give you the best information they have at the moment, because they're dealing often with life and death issues. Media mistakes, just as we talked about before with the Reaction Watch. This is from the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. I think it's connected to Harvard. And what they do is they have this program that they did for several years called Top Media Corrections of 2017. Now, this was the latest I could find, but I would like to, when I had the time, to dig in more, because we need more sites like this that say, okay, this is how the media screwed up in the last year. And wouldn't it be embarrassing if we found that we were posting a lot of stories online that have since been discredited, particularly when the media outlet went, oh, our bad. Duke University has what they call the Reporters Lab that also helps reporters, professional investigators, look at fact-checking things coming up. And I love the fact that they make it open to the general public so any of us can look at that. I think that's very cool. So how do we master online resources? I really think that sheepdogs, these are Australian sheepdogs and border collies are probably the pinnacle of the intelligent species on the planet, right? So that's when I think of mastering. I think of sheepdogs as being the masters of the universe. So first thing I urge everyone listening or watching today, please stop being part of the problem. I would say 80% of the people who I connect with on social media are librarians or professional researchers, and at least once a week, somebody posts something, and I go and check, and I find that it isn't true from a very credible source. You know, again, there's always questions, but particularly recently it was like, oh, look at this terrible thing that was happening, and it was a photo that actually had been taken 25 years ago from a different source. So let's just take the pledge. We're never going to repost information unless, particularly things about quote breaking news, unless it's accurate. Its accuracy could survive examination in a courtroom, so that we located and reviewed the primary source. One of the problems with the internet is that none of us are being held accountable for what we post and what we repost. And So we can unintentionally be part of the people who, the group of people who are virally spreading what are in effect things that aren't true. And so stop being the problem, I think, is a good place to start. As I said before, I don't want you to count on someone else's list of sources. And we always are tweaking our own lists. You know, this is good for this is good for that. Even the best site or the person can become complacent and slip up. Just something we have to be aware of. So there are good things too, and there are some things I'm very grateful about having all these online resources that I can review, and the key idea here is multiple sites very quickly, having to do with a news story, a scientific study, a law, a campaign, a candidate, a warning or something, that I can pretty quickly in an hour look at 20 or 30 sites, see which ones repeat themselves, which ones use the same language, which ones are citing each other, which ones are new, and give us a different perspective on what's going on. So the fact that we have choices, I think, is a really important way that we can start, we'll never eliminate it, but start reducing the amount of fake news out there. So this all makes me feel good. This all makes me feel good. I love the idea, and this always was the main part of the work that we did at our office, which today our company is called Pattern Research. Our project was called the Office for Open Network. And part of the thing that we were darn good at was building think tanks, our own personal think tank of people with lots of different ideas. Not a website because it was before electricity, but being able to have what we, you know, our Rolodex, our database of all kinds of people, again, from across the political spectrum, all kinds of expertise that we could run things by. Sometimes it was pretty simple. For example, somebody sent, and sometimes it was kind of fun, you know, someone sent us their proposal for a new computer company. And they said, I have been to every single bank in Denver and I've been turned down by every single bank and no one will tell me why. Well, we said, well, you know what? In our database, our think tank, we have this wonderful retired banker named Jim, and he's retired, good guy. I'll call him up and see if he'll do us a favor. And Jim said, sure, send me the proposal. And we sent Jim the proposal, and we had a little phone conference with Jim and me and the gentleman who had the new company. And Jim said, it's something you wouldn't know if you weren't in the banking industry, but this particular person who's on your board of advisories is a known crook. And these are the things this person has done. And I'm speaking personally, I've seen these things. It's something I couldn't speak about when I worked at the bank, and it's a private matter, but I don't want to see you hurt by that. All you have to do is take their name off of your report and sever your ties with this person. And um, the guy did it, and he called me a week later. He said, I got funded by the first bank I visited. And they sort of shuffled through the papers, looked and went, okay, fine. And I got the funding. Now, that sounds kind of mean to some people, but you know what? There's a lot of things like that out in the world that you're not going to find in a database. You're not going to find online. You have to talk to different people. And yes, we did check what our friend Jim said by calling a few other people off the record. And they said, oh yeah, that person opens bank accounts, burns through, writes thousands of dollars worth of bad checks, goes bankrupt, and then does it again and does it again. And some of that was public record we were able to look at. That, and we want to get people who aren't just like the mainstream people. We want people who think about something in an unusual manner. And we call them allies, not because they're people who necessarily agree with us, but we've come to respect each other. And I can call them up and say something like, what do people from your point of view think of this issue or idea? And get a straight answer, and then use that to ask other and different questions. And yes, at some point, there's a lot of conflicting advice, and you're going to either have to flip a coin or decide which path you're going to take. So for me, it's not just being a dilettante, like what exciting, crazy stuff is popping up in the internet. My clients have to use information to help their health or to further their business or their nonprofit or their elected officials who have to make hard decisions. So it's not just entertainment. It's something more serious than that. And yes, again, I love books, so not everything is online. Not everybody's online about things. And that whole idea of cultivating outliers is simply because I want to push against the idea that everyone you disagree with is someone you shouldn't be talking to. I would say most of my library friends would be horrified if people started pulling books off the shelves of people they disagree with. Even people who are kind of out there wacka wacka, they wouldn't want those books pulled from the shelf. Well, I feel the same way about people. Yes, there's some people I won't have anything to do with, not because of their political views, but I don't like how they conduct themselves, or I don't find them trustworthy for some reason or another. And we have to remember again that something we believe today might not be true tomorrow, and something that we think is nuts might be tomorrow's truth. So it's verify and refute. Verify that the resource is the complete primary resource and hasn't been cherry picked. We want to look to see if there's different versions out there, and usually the oldest tends to be the best. If we do want to check on something, we want the journalistic standard that I learned studying journalism was 3 independent sources to verify if something is true. If it's really important, 5. And yes, I have clients who are working on their business plans who want me to look at 10 or 20. I'm not making that up, to verify a piece of information might be true. Some things that I want to know are who paid for the site, who writes the checks for that study or that think tank or that community group, whatever. What are the information cited, so we don't have any secret sources, and those links again, primary sources, sorry, broken record. I really like something about the online thing. I like the fact that oftentimes, most of the time, you can reach the writer. The writer does have a byline and an email, and you can have a private conversation with them oftentimes. That people are very clear about what's a fact versus what is an opinion or an interpretation of the facts. I want to call out, it was Newsweek recently that covered a story. And the thing that I thought was wonderful about the way they covered the story, and I had read about this particular issue in 10 other places, Newsweek simply did the facts in boring NPR, BBC rules. I mean, it was sort of like, here's exactly what happened. They didn't use any adjectives or adverbs. Here's a little exercise you can do. You can print out an article for someone and cross out every single adjective and adverb and see what kind of story you're left with. Well, that's what Newsweek did, right? There was no drama in the story. It was just the facts. I thought it was wonderful. Are there varied point of views? I think that's important. And how quick is that institution ready to admit that they've made mistakes and correct them publicly? For many years, Forbes magazine, which was my favorite business magazine, would bring in, I think it was 10 columnists who would spend a year predicting the stock market and investments. And they would get a column and they'd be able to talk about it. And some of them were credentialed, some of them had, investment businesses and whatever. But it was surprising all the people who didn't want to post in Forbes. And the reason for that was Forbes made them keep track of the success of their advice, and at the end of the year would post a chart and then present the chart to the writer, and they would have to justify their successes and failures. Rarely did someone survive more than a year with that kind of scrutiny. It was pretty, you're under the microscope. So I look for people who are willing to say, my bad, I made a mistake, I looked at this things incorrectly, we have a retraction that's sincere and specific. That means a lot to me in a site's trustworthiness. Less reliable, the breaking news, everything's speculation, it's all filler. There's no news. Well, it could be, it might be, maybe it is, there's nothing there. I find almost all political and cultural commentators less reliable when it comes to facts I want. What I call the binary analysis, that it's either this or that. Well, that's not really true of most of what happens in the world. It's more complicated than that. Celebrity commentators, even worse than the average political or cultural commentators, sob stories that may or may not be representative of what's actually going on. And anyone who treats a political opponent disrespectfully is off my list. I'm sorry, it's like noise in my ear. It's really hard for me to overcome my bias when somebody has ad hominem attacks and nasty things they're saying. So closing, I want to say, I want you to start figuring out who you think are trustworthy for the most part, particularly reporters and scholars, and follow their careers, because I think most of the time, under most circumstances, you can trust those people. So with that, I want to turn things back over to Kim and see if we have any time for any questions or comments from our audience today. Oops, it always does this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pat, for this. Awesome. This was such a really great, informative webinar.
Thank you very
Um,
much. And you can see I'm pretty passionate about it.
yeah, which is great. Did we have any questions from our attendees? You can put it in the chat or in the Q&A.
I had seen a couple pop up and then they disappeared. So, but it may be me. I'm terrible at.
Well, there was a question of like, can they access the slides? And so I did
Okay.
post a link so they could access the slides.
Terrific, terrific.
And so if there was any other questions that you might have for Pat while she is here and available.
I see something's popped up here.
Oh yeah. It says sites for political fact checking.
I think a couple of the ones that I gave you are pretty good. The problem I have with them oftentimes is that they're not as open. Now, one of the sites, and let me go back here a little bit. And it might be Pointer, but one of the sites that I looked here, or the Duke Reporters Lab, take a look at the Duke's Reporters Lab site, and I would go through all of them because I did notice that one of these sites did have a place that was reporting political stuff, and I think that I believe it was the Duke's Reporter Lab would be a good place to look for that. Anything you can't find, I don't charge for phone or email consultations, so feel free to be able to contact me for any of that.
Excellent. Any other questions? Okay. Well, awesome. Well, oh wait, hold on. Got one in. Certification for fact checkers.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Certification for fact checkers.
Well, there's what I call phony certification. I'm sure there's someone out there that's issuing some kind of associate's degree or something like that. The fact checkers I know tend to have science degrees, English degrees, journalism degrees, librarians. There's a lot of librarians out there who develop careers in fact checking. The problem is that there are fewer publications that actually hire and use fact checkers than in the olden days. So usually the path to become a fact checker starts with some media outlet, and it's sort of at the bottom of the food chain. You don't get paid very much to do it, and also you're always on a deadline, so maybe you aren't able to do the fact checking you've needed. And I hate to say it, but there are some publications I've seen, like the New Yorker magazine, which I really like, and the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, that my husband and I have actually written notes to, because and Forbes, my favorite business magazine, where we saw that there were not, it wasn't interpretation, it wasn't opinion, they stated a fact that simply wasn't true. And we contacted them and said, here is our evidence that what you posted wasn't true. And I was very pleased that one of the senior editors at Forbes actually printed a retraction in the next magazine based on what we sent him, that satisfied him that yes, he had misspoken.
Excellent. And then I have a question from actually our Facebook Live comments. Best fact-finding websites to vet stories.
I don't know of any, because everything's happening so fast, but I'm going to go back again and say this. Would you take a look at the list I gave you of the journalistic related sites that help journalists, professional journalists like the Duke Reporters Lab look at facts. And I think that that will lead you to a lot of very good sites. So that's my first place. But there's so much information out there. I can't give you one place to look. I can't give you, this is the one place to solve your problem. Remember, one of the things I said before, there aren't any shortcuts. I'm sorry. If I knew the shortcuts, I'd be really rich, and I'm not rich.
That's fair. Okay, we got another one in the Q&A. Fact-checking certification for fact-checking organizations.
Say that once again, please. I'm a little hard of hearing. I
Oh, no, you're
apologize.
fine.
Uh-huh.
Fact-checking certification for fact-checking organizations.
See, that's what people want, the shortcut, with all good respect. Oh, good, they have certified you, so I don't have to look and do the research myself. I'm not the right person. I'm not the right person for seeing the world that way. It goes back to certification. I mean, we're not talking about laws of physics, folks, or biblical precept. We're talking about somebody who sort of lays their hand on someone else's shoulder and said, "You are certified." And then the audience stops thinking. And so I am very suspect if I saw somebody have a little gold label. You know what I like? I like going into a restaurant and seeing that it's been given a stellar grade by our local public health. That I like. That's a certification I believe in. But fact-checking stuff becomes so incestuous that no, I can't point to anybody, not because I think they're crooks, but because I can't give up my right to examine and question anything that I see. And yes, it takes time. So I learned not to let my life be affected by most of what I read and see online.
Okay. Well, you guys, thank you so much for your great questions. I think it's about time to wrap things up. So again, thank you, Pat, for joining us today for this amazing webinar. And yeah, for all of our attendees, feel free to go to our website, dospace.org, to check out our calendar for any future webinars. And then if you're interested in any of our past ones, you could always go to our YouTube channel, our DoSpace YouTube channel, and you can also check out some of the past webinars that Pat has put on for us as well. So thank you so much, Pat, and we look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you. Thanks, Kim, and thanks, folks, for joining us.
Okay, have a good day.